Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Dialogue for Change, an office house on police reform with Professor Yasser Payne and Jim Nolan. My name is Crystal Chapman, and I will be your moderator for today. And our policing and legal system should keep communities safe, treat people fairly, and use fiscal resources wisely. Yet more people in our state and country are deprived than ever before, unfairly and unnecessarily, with no benefit to public safety. We have instances of police violence to systematic inequalities produced by overly punitive sentencing laws and guidelines to barriers to jobs, education, and housing. By record, the devastating consequences of our harsh and ineffective, costly criminal justice system have fallen overwhelmingly on low-income people, Black and Brown communities, and poverty-stricken communities. I will introduce our panelists today, Professor Yasser Payne. Professor Payne is a professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice and the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware. Dr. Payne's Street Ethnographic Research Program examines notions of resilience, structural violence, and gun violence with street identified Black Americans by utilizing street participatory action research, which is called PAR, the process of doing research and activism with street identified population. Dr. Payne's research program also focuses on economic and educational inequality and gangster rap music and culture. Dr. Payne has published in a number of peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, and op-eds, and he and his colleagues have authored the 2023 book project, Murdertown, USA, Homicide, Structural Violence, and Activism in Wilmington, Delaware. Professor Jim Nolan has been a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at West Virginia University for the past 25 years. His funded research on police reform has come from the U.S. Department of Justice, American Statistical Association, and the National Science Foundation. His current research shows that most efforts to reform the American police aim to identify, deter, train, and terminate bad apple cops. Although bad apple cops, bigoted cops do exist, Professor Nolan believes they are not the source of the current problems. Instead, violence and discrimination in the practice of policing have structural roots. In other words, it is the good apple cop following the Constitution, state and federal law, and professional police practices that create so much harm. His current project in Baltimore, Maryland, tests strategies for reimagining the American police. Over the past 20 years, he has published 3 books and 70 book chapters or journal articles, mostly related to the topic of policing. And my first question will go to Professor Nolan. What are the structural sources of violence and bigotry in America, policing, and why are these so hard to change? Professor Nolan?
Before I begin, I want to thank the ACLU of Delaware for hosting this important panel and for having me participate. I'm particularly thrilled to be on a panel with Dr. Yasser Payne, whose work I know well and respect a lot. I assigned his book, Murdertown, USA, in all my policing classes at WVU. As everyone knows, the extreme cases of police brutality over the past decade or more in many places around the country, including Delaware, raised lots of concerns. Some people explain the violence as a result of bigoted bad apples who are protected behind a secretive blue wall. Others recognize the systemic nature of police bigotry and violence and call to defund the police or abolish the institution. Still others promote reform, but the record's not very good on that front. So what are we to do? So over the next 40 minutes or so, Yasser and I will share some ideas based on our research and experiences in hopes to stimulate your ideas so we might find a way forward together. There are many ways to think about structure. Typically, when you see stable rates of violence or crime or school failure or drug use or drug abuse, you can be certain there's a latent structure producing them. In this presentation, I'm referring to institutional structure. So think of an institutional structure as a game being played on a field like a baseball field or a football field. The game has rules, boundaries, positions, a logic for action, ways to score points and earn status. In this sense, the game determines the behavior of the players. To play on a field together, though, in a coordinated way, the game must be internalized in players so that everybody knows what everybody else is doing or what they should be doing. By playing together in this way, the players reproduce the structure. In slide 1, you see this, it's depicted this way. The term structure really just means the rules, the logic, and rewards of the game. And it's symbolized by the blue triangle. Practice refers to not only the way players behave, but to their socially molded dispositions and way of seeing things. Over time, players internalize the structure and develop a feel for the game. This is represented by the blue triangles on the foreheads of the players. When this happens, the logic of the game becomes common sense. So this is easy to see, like in a courtroom, for example, which is structured in a particular way. Like there are positions on that field. There are judges and prosecutors and defense attorneys, bailiffs and court reporters. There's rules of engagement. There's an order of the presentation, the way to ask questions. There's ways to score points, like by winning the case or making insightful remarks or having a powerful opening or closing. And the structure is internalized, it becomes common sense in the profession. Then by continuing to act in this way, the players reproduce the structure. This is depicted by C. The structure determines the practice, and the practice reproduces the structure. So next I'll show you how this applies in policing, American policing. And change the slide, please. So in slide 2, the structure of American policing begins with a professional mandate for crime and social control by way of law enforcement. This fact is very important. Although the American police system has always protected the interests of the rich and powerful, about 100 years ago, the movement by police leaders formed to disconnect the profession from political patronage. In doing so, the police profession was converted to the law enforcement profession. This narrowed the focus of policing from helping communities remain safe and providing coercive control over those deemed deviant, threatening, or undesirable. The FBI UCR program was born in this era to allow crime and social control to be the metrics of police success. So the structure of policing, represented by the triangle, is the law enforcement game, which includes rules, logic, rewards that prioritize law enforcement outputs, such as arrests, citations, the seizure of guns and drugs, over community safety and social justice outcomes. In practice, this approach gives rise to a law enforcement identity, an authoritarian disposition, and a worldview that has white, black, male, female, liberal, and conservative police officers all doing the same violent, discriminatory, and counterproductive things. None of the reforms over the past year have changed any of this. Here are some things you're likely to hear inside of a police department. We're the thin blue line. We separate order from chaos. There are more good people than bad, so our job is to catch and punish the bad ones. We must go home safe, so watch my six. That means watch my back. His sudden moves made him appear to be armed and dangerous. And then these structures and practices are reinforced by way of economic rewards, such as promotions, and symbolic rewards, such as ribbons on the uniform, scrambled eggs on the hat, and visible signs of respect, like a hand salute. In the next couple of slides, I'll show briefly how the law enforcement program, the game, actually works. Next slide, please. So in this next slide, I compare 4 cities. But many cities are like this. And many states are like this also, but I want to compare Wilmington to these cities. So if you look at the far right-hand column, you see the total arrests in Wilmington between 2011 and 2021 is 38,802. This is in a city of 70,000 people. 44% of those are for social control. That's for disorderly conduct, alcohol violations, drug violations, and things like the FBI call crimes against society. The number of arrests in Wilmington is like 85% of the entire population of Wilmington, aged between 18 and 64. And with all these arrests, still 63% of the homicides, 58% of violent crimes, and 87% of property crimes go unsolved. But that's not all. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you racial disparities in Delaware. And the way to interpret these numbers is this. So if you take the number arrested over the Black population, white residents over the white population, you get a disparity index. So if, for example, if they're the same, it would be 1. But anything over 1 shows the racial disparity in favor of white. So in other words, 1.61, the DSP traffic stops in 2019, the racial disparity index of 1.61. That means that Black residents were 1.61 times more likely to be stopped than their white counterparts. Or if you drop the 1, you can convert it to a percentage, say 61%. So it's 61% higher statewide, but 3 times higher in Newcastle County. You see the tickets, 57% higher statewide, 75% higher chance for Black residents to get tickets in Newcastle County. And then DSP searches when stopped, almost 3 times higher statewide and over 3 times higher in Newcastle County if you're Black. But that's not all. If you go look at the nation throughout all the states, next slide. You see these same disparities in every state. So if you look at Delaware, you see for total arrest, 2.7 times more likely if you're Black. For drug arrest, 3.2 times more likely. For marijuana arrest, 4.5 times more likely. The next column is the total victims of police killings between 2015 and 2022. It's 19 in Delaware, but you can scan up and down and see how it fares in other states. And the racial disparity index for police killings is 2.9 times more likely if you're Black. So if you go to the next slide, with all these arrests and these racial disparities, you still see high levels of crime or homicide rates in Wilmington. And this is really the focus of Yasser's book. Basically, the failure of the police to actually keep places safe by way of the law enforcement approach requires a front stage performance to retain legitimacy. And so, in the front stage, you hear officers saying things like, we use evidence-based practices and we're sure to work, or we can protect you, or we're here to help you. And there's a sign in the front where partners trust us. But behind the curtain, you see a sign, we are the thin blue line. We're the law enforcement warriors. And you see officers, heavily armed officers say, we must make more arrests. Too many criminals around here. The community won't help us. They protect the bad guys. We make record numbers of arrests and the community still complain. We need more cops and better weapons to make more arrests. So the structure of the law enforcement game determines the behaviors that are ineffective and harmful. It's internalized in officers and it's common sense, even though it doesn't work or make sense. So later I'll show some ideas about how to change the structure of the American police institution with an example from Wilmington.
And Professor Payne, would you have to add to that?
I think excellent presentation, comprehensive analysis. I love the structural analysis. Also, I love the fact that Dr. Nolan really took us into the culture, right, of policing. right? I'm a ethnographer. I do mixed methods, but ethnography just means the study of culture. So I'm always very interested in the culture of any group. And I'm definitely very interested in, not only of the culture of Black communities and how they understand policing, but the culture of police themselves, right? I don't think I think it would be really difficult to do a real, whatever that means, ethnography of policing culture from the inside out. I think it's probably, there's a way to maybe pull it off, but nonetheless, studies like that would be very revealing, and also very informative with regard to change, right? And or how to even approach it. So, but those are some of my quick thoughts. Excellent set of PowerPoints though, definitely.
Well, thank you for your input. Now, I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
What are some of the core reasons leading to lasting and enduring tension between police and low-income Black communities? And what does this strained relationship look like today between Black boys, men, and girls?
Yes. Great question. So let me just preface my comments by first saying thank you to the ACLU for this opportunity to really have, I think, a deep, honest, some respects raw conversation, right, about policing and what really needs to happen, right, to create the change that we all want to see, right? And I think we need more and more opportunities like this, right? We're really talking shop, right, about what is occurring and what we have to do, right? And I think, repeated conversations in a variety of ways is so necessary. Also, I just want to quickly underscore and/or say it is an honor to be on the panel with Dr. Jim Nolan. I think we are way overdue with regard to doing something like this. And I look forward to doing more with him. We share the same theoretical perspective that is just very refreshing, at least from my standpoint. Also, I just want to also quickly say, and then I'm going to respond to this question. Please just hear my comments, right, in the right spirit, everyone. I can be impassioned, right? But I'm coming from a good place, right? And/or particularly the place of the people, and/or what I think they want to see, and/or what I think we need to do to produce the change, once again, that we all want to see. Regarding your question, right, I think there are a number of core reasons leading to a lasting or enduring tension, particularly in poor Black communities. I do think other communities too. My work, typically is in low-income Black communities, though, right? And I do think that community is one of the communities that are struggling, with harmful policing. In any event, I think overall the relationship today is bad, right? To put it lightly, has historically been bad. And this terse or inherently adversarial relationship will more than likely remain for the foreseeable future, right? And I say that more as an objective assessment, not necessarily as a way to flare us up, although I think that has its place, right? I'm not necessarily opposed to that approach, right? But just as an objective assessment of where we are and where it looks like we're going. Also, much of the tension, I think, can be attributed to the structural, what I sometimes describe as the structural violence complex, or to deep or entrenched structural inequality. That inequality is by design, right? And that kind of baked in inequality is extremely racialized. So at least according to critical race theory, right, which I'm a proponent of, you have a scenario where all institutions, I think, according to the theory in the US, have this kind of deep racialized inequality baked into the setup of the institution, and that also includes police departments as an institution, right? Thus, I think the question really is ultimately, at its core, essentially or effectively, then what is the role of police if all of this is true? And it is true, right? And I would argue the primary role of police, because of this kind of structural context that we're in, right? So now the police officer, as articulated well by Dr. Nolan, right? But now the police officer, because of an entrenched culture, right? That culture, right, necessitates that he or she, right, moves in terms of protect at all costs the state and or the interest of the state, And anything that, right, according to critical race theory, at least according to critical race theory, anything that kind of deviates from the structural order or structural frame of reference, this way of being, has to be reined in. It must be punished, and it must be criminalized. And this structural order does require a criminalized group for the order to function. This is classic critical race theory, and or how critical race theory is used to understand policing, particularly within marginalized communities. So if this dynamic is going on, and it is, wow, then what are we to do? Then what is right? So how do we approach, right, a system or a department that's organized from this standpoint? Let me close. Ultimately, I think this is a way to understand the enduring tension, this kind of structural context, right? So that we can actually improve this relationship. I think this is the way we go about improving relationships. One of the things that we do, particularly in the Center for Structural Equity, with Wolfie and the guys, Sean, Voch, I mean, man, they're doing God's work over there in that center in North Tatnall work, a lot of community-based workshops, but a set of those workshops are geared towards, right, informing youth and adults, right, about theories like critical race theory, structural violence theory, right? Theories like Black feminist thought. We're teaching everyday people these theories as a way to understand their condition with policing, right, and or violence and or other issues, right? Nonetheless, this tension is also born out of, right, this structural dynamic, and the tension is born out of what is believed to be a profound, also, I think tension in the community is also born out of what is believed to be a profound indifference. Right, so you have folk that are in these neighborhoods that, from their perspective, their assessment, there is a profound indifference by law enforcement and other city and state officials, I might add, right? And there's an indifference to a people that are clearly immersed in social and structural trauma, right? With this said, I do think police or police departments are necessary, particularly within this existing structural order. However, I believe these departments generally fall short of their full potential to serve poor Black communities, other communities too, while they typically deliver that full promise for whiter and wealthier communities.
All righty. Professor Nolan, you have any response to his assessment?
Absolutely. First of all, I love Dr. Payne's perspective, and he's entirely right in the sense that it is structured, and it's from a critical race perspective. We say that these institutions are designed to control Black people, and that is the case. In the 1920s, when the law enforcement approach became the way of thinking about doing policing in the United States, it wasn't really about crime prevention, was about controlling the deviant classes. That included Black people, people of color, immigrants. And today we know much more about the causes of crime and violence, but the law enforcement approach doesn't deal with that. But it's common sense, so it's very difficult to change. But it's definitely deeply rooted in this idea of controlling populations of people. The other thing I would say is, the other thing I love about Dr. Payne's work is his PAR methods. He involves people in the research, and so it's not just to publish something and put it on a shelf, but it's to mobilize people to organize and to overcome together. And I love that approach. And I think that in terms of the way I've learned to think about police reform, is the PAR methods are really a way to reimagine policing, that they're collecting data with the public to use together to make places safe and strong. And I'll tell you a little bit how that can happen on my next question.
Well, the next question is for you, Professor Nolan. Are there ways to restructure American policing in ways that restore trust, repair harms, restore relationships, solve problems, encourage transparency, and actually make places safer for communities and the police? What would need to happen to make these kind of structural changes to Delaware policing, and more broadly to American policing system.
So what I want to do is I want to use the Wilmington Police Department to show how a structural change could be set in motion. So step one would be go to the original authorizing legislation and look at the mission statement. And if you look at the Wilmington City Code, you see this. The police department shall have the power and its duty shall be to perform the following function. Law enforcement. It shall preserve the public peace, prevent and detect crime, police streets, highways, and park areas, and enforce traffic statutes, ordinances, and regulations relating thereto. The department shall at times aid in the administration and enforcement of statutes in the state of Delaware and ordinance of the city. So you can see law enforcement is the primary focus there. The Wilmington Police mission statement, then, this is the current mission. The mission of the Wilmington Police Department is to work in partnership with our residents to make our community safer through the delivery of professional law enforcement services, and a comprehensive approach designed to meet the public safety needs of our city. This mission will be fostered by every member of the department. So you can see that this law enforcement focuses in both the legislation, enabling legislation, and the mission. And so to change that, you might want to first write a preamble before you suggest a change. So let me, the next slide, I'll show you what a preamble might look like for structural change. Something like this. Whereas police agencies in Delaware are sometimes referred to as law enforcement, creating a language trap that focuses on law enforcement outputs, like arrests, tickets, the quantity of drugs and guns. And whereas the current law enforcement approach has limited ability to create strong, safe places in the city, discriminating by race and creating an atmosphere of oppression. Whereas a community atmosphere of equity, inclusion, and justice is a more effective way to keep communities safe. A reimagined role of the police profession should aim at creating these conditions. And whereas the intent of the legislative change offered below are to refocus the police on creating safe and strong community outcomes. Therefore, be it resolved that the recommended changes to the Wilmington City Code on the police department function, chapter 2, A and B, and pertinent part be adopted. So the next slide. Here's a way it could, the legislation could change, and which would force the mission to change. So a revised Wilmington City Code might look like this. The police department shall have the power, and its duty shall be to perform the following functions. Community safety and social justice. The police will create safe and strong neighborhoods and communities throughout the city. This involves building relationships among community members and between residents and the police. The police shall use law enforcement as one of many tools in their efforts to make communities safe and strong, and only as a last resort. Law enforcement. The responsibility to enforce laws provides a tool as a tool of last resort for police to help communities become strong and safe and to seek justice. And then a revised mission statement would look like this. The mission of the Wilmington Police Department is to work in a true partnership with residents, businesses, and stakeholders to safe, strong, and vibrant communities. Within neighborhoods, the police will provide tools and resources to work collaboratively to strengthen bonds, solve problems, and reduce crime with empathy, understanding, and through nonviolent means. And then the next slide. And then this would change, to change the game like this would change the rules, the logic, the structure of the game. And officers, the disposition, the way of thinking and acting and perceiving would be different. So you may hear things like, no more thin blue line. We're all on the same side. People are not good or bad. Harmful behaviors emerge from horrible conditions. Our job is to change conditions. We must make sure all of us go home safe at night, the community and the police. His sudden moves made him appear to be armed and dangerous, but our relationship told me otherwise. And so this structure and these way of acting and perceiving would be reinforced by a new set of rewards, such as the creative problem-solving reward, or the de-escalation ribbon, the restorative justice ribbon, or the bridging differences ribbon, or I love this one, the large blue circle ribbon, formerly the thin blue line award, and the strong communities ribbon.
Okay.
Later, I'll show how to think about this in a way to deal with accountability from this revised structure.
Well, I have an audience question for either Professor Payne or Professor Nolan. Newcastle County has a police accountability board, PAB. However, Sussex County has not been aggressive in establishing a board. Are police accountability boards effective, do you think?
From my perspective, I think that's, it's a great question. So I think, and I think in general, unless these boards are well resourced, right? Unless you have a scenario where the fraternal order, I think, is involved in a way that's not adversarial, where police departments is not, where they're kind of on board with it, where the community actually has real input. So I think in theory, yes, great idea. But I think at the end of the day, right, again, I'm gonna keep going back to critical race theory. It's foundational to my work, right? So is change possible, whether it's in the form of a board like this or something else? But is change possible when, right, an outgroup is required, right? And I think ultimately that's what's going on, at least according to CRT, all institutions, major institutions like police have to play a role in undermining the outgroup, right? That's a classic idea. So housing, education, policing, right? It wouldn't matter, right? You need an outgroup, particularly for the economy to function. In fact, another way of thinking about it would be, and so I think all of this kind of what I'm sharing, what I will continue to share, I think will be useful for a board, particularly, right, in increasing their awareness and how they think about policy and or approaching police in board form. Right, and I think there's and this is CRT, this is Derek Bell, right? There's a profound lack of awareness, and that's not a pejorative about how things work. That's why we're in the neighborhoods teaching theory, and we're let's understand and connect the theoretical dots so that we can do the practical more efficiently, right? And we're not opposed to working with police or other state agencies or whomever, city agencies, right? But at the end of the day, we have to work, right? Derek Bell instructs us, we must do that kind of work, right, with real awareness, right? But nonetheless, also, I think a lot of policing is local, right, and or the politics around it is local, right? So what can happen or may take place in Newcastle County may be more challenging or difficult or different for all kinds of reasons in a place like Sussex.
Professor Nolan, what would be your thoughts to accountability, police accountability boards work and how they should work?
I'm going to say something briefly here, but then I think in my next question, I deal with the issue of accountability. But in terms of a police accountability board, I think they're effective. But first, there has to be a way of thinking about accountability. Accountability for what? And so typically, police accountability has been to, did the police follow policy? Did they follow the law? And as Dr. Payne is saying, the law and the policies are laced with, they allow for force. They allow for, coercive control over certain classes of people. And therefore, the outcomes are, as I've showed you in with some of my slides in the beginning, with the racial disparities and the inability to deal effectively with crime. Even though it doesn't work, the outcomes are not only not the issue; it's whether or not they follow policy. And if a police accountability board is just to see if they follow policy, they're not gonna do very much. But if the police accountability board focuses on outcomes, are they achieving justice? Are they are reducing racial discrimination? Then I think that they can be effective.
And our next question goes to Professor Payne. What are your thoughts about the recent battery of violence-based outreach programs like Cease Violence, Cure Violence, Focus Deterrence, the GVI, Street PAR, or the Wilmington Intervention Team, for example? To what extent have these programs been reducing crime and improving our neighborhoods? Also, typically, what is the relationship like between these programs and law enforcement?
Great question. Great question. And let me just take that last question just real quick. I'm gonna address that head on. I think in many respects, a number of these policing outreach programs, particularly around violence and/or other forms of crime, right? Not all, and they're implemented in varying ways, right? So let me be careful with my language. But I think a number of them are problematic, right? I think they're working in unethical ways, right, and/or highly deceptive ways. And by that, I mean this, right? At the end of the day, a number of community members, particularly those on the front line, particularly those violence interrupters, right, those folk that are responsible for getting the message out on the ground, are unaware of the relationship that sometimes their outreach program, the larger program, has with law enforcement, right? And a number of these issues are now coming up all across the country. And they're getting guys in hot water because they just don't know. It's happening in Wilmington all the way to California. These cases, right? These kind of enraged debates with guys on the ground, right? Who are being called out, right? But let me take a step back. I do think in theory, community-based programs, outreach programs, right? That involve members of the legal system and/or the streets or returning citizens. I do think on its face, it is a great idea, right? And/or what so many in neighborhoods, right, particularly marginalized neighborhoods, have been calling for, right? So programs like GVI or Focus Deterrence or Cease Violence or Cure Violence have responded to that call, right? However, a major limitation of these outreach programs are that they are top heavy, right? And we don't have a whole lot of good research. We have some, it's emerging, right, around these programs. There are some really breakout studies, particularly that New York City Cure Violence studies, right? A cure violence program, if properly resourced and implemented, can reduce violence, right, by at least in New York in that study in some neighborhoods by 2/3, right? And/or particularly if we're looking at that that outreach program, I think it was focused deterrence based, but out in Richmond, California, where they were able to bring down over 3 years the homicide rate down by about 75%, right? You do have some breakout examples where folk come together in a kind of comprehensive way, and they're right from the city all the way down to the ground, and they're able to create real change. I don't think that is the issue in most instances. I think, once again, it's top heavy. I think ultimately controlled and led by agencies and/or people who are not from the community. Also, getting poor Black people to be on the front lines of community canvassing is not in and of itself true cooperation with communities. And in many instances, many of these local residents are being exploited, and they don't even realize what's going on, right? And that's what's chiefly being exploited, right? Their ignorance in the power dynamics of the process. They are well-intentioned, right? Not to mention, in my biggest gripes, these programs typically leave the streets or interrupters or violent outreach workers out of the research part of the process. And the research part of the process is where the power and the resources are ultimately located. That's why we do street PAR, right? So we do believe in getting on the ground and canvassing, and we are involved in that with regard to Wilmington. However, it's important for community to learn the value of their data. Stop just hiring guys and putting them out there, putting them in an economically unstable state. Sometimes the grant's in and work is here, sometimes it's not, and then they have to really be on the ground and really touch base with those who may be involved with violence. We're putting them in the most precarious scenario, right, in the most under-resourced circumstance. And we're asking them to make take all the risk, right, while not properly financing, incentivizing, or resourcing them. So street PAR teaches them the value of their data. It teaches them about the hierarchical structure and control, right? At the end of the day, they need to learn the value of the data, acquire the skills to comprehend and conduct the analysis, right? And around policing, around shootings, around homicides, around schooling outcomes, around the racial wealth gap, right? And then, right, inform not only their neighborhoods, but also our city and state stakeholders. What we have now is an outreach model that's essentially top heavy, with academics, police, and other officials controlling the data and using the data in larger program. Yes, they're using the data in a number of instances to arrest mostly low-income young people of color. Right, I write about that in Murder Town, USA. In fact, the GVI program, in a respectful fashion, after reading the book, and or that part of the book in particular, they had a meeting with me. Right, I underscore very clearly how law enforcement in Wilmington is working directly with GVI, right, to indict large swaths of young people in Wilmington. I say that outright, and I got my ducks in a row, right? Not to mention the chief of police acknowledged that in a press conference. Oh my God, after promising for so long that this isn't going on. I think he was a little excited and just kind of came out. But nonetheless, I met with GVI in a very nice office, actually, in a conference room with 20 or so people, some from the governor's office. And they all acknowledged what the chief of police said. Many in prison have issues, because they all read in the book, and they didn't realize this was going on. And some of the guys are hired on GVI. They now realize that in a precarious scenario, right? Let me just say for the record, that GVI office just emphatically stated, they are aware of what the chief of police said, but they emphatically stated at least that arm of GVI has nothing to do with cooperating with police. It doesn't mean that they aren't using their data, though, right? To figure out who's who and what's what and what's going on. But, right, so we had a respectful conversation, but this is going on across the country, right? So in any event, let me close up by saying this. I think we need more research in this area, meaning we need folk from the neighborhoods getting on the ground, right, to conduct analysis around the outreach programs themselves, to get a good sense of what's going on. There's a student, a doctoral student, working on a wonderful dissertation at Rutgers University in their criminal justice department. Her name is Jordan Acosta, for what it's worth. And she's doing a major study, right, for her dissertation in this area of inquiry, right? And we need more folk, and folk from her, New York City, they're joining in on that analysis, right? So I just think, I think at the end of the day, I think most folk, again, on the ground are well-intentioned. They just aren't informed or lack the awareness of how the outreach programs are being used, right, to empty, I would argue, to empty these neighborhoods out, vis-a-vis through incarceration. And also, I think they also play a role in the gentrification or redevelopment that we're seeing.
Thank you for that. Professor Nolan, what are your thoughts on the programs that we have, the outreach programs that we currently have, if you're aware of them, being a former police officer?
I am aware of them, and I'm mostly critical. I think that most of the programs and most of the attempts, as Dr. Payne suggested, are well-intentioned. The people want to do something right, but they still have this law enforcement, social control through law enforcement idea. It's the framework. It's this. It's the triangle. It's internalized. The disposition and the way of seeing things. So let's try something. We have gun violence intervention. We have these types of things, but it's really trying to figure out different ways of dealing with the symptoms and not getting to the root, some of the root causes, changing the conditions beneath it. And so in that sense, I think that these are counterproductive. I also think that these are shiny things that the government, sends a lot of money after. They put a lot of money into these deterrence models and those sorts of things. And they really are, they may have some, from an evidence-based perspective, show statistically significant decreases in crime over time. But if you go back sometime later, the conditions are not changed, and therefore it's back to the same rate as it was before. So and from my perspective, none of it works, really. And so it really takes a structural perspective, like I described from the institutional perspective, and what Dr. Payne describes from the social perspective, dealing with inequality and dealing with the institutional processes for building strong, safe places.
Thank you for that. Well, our last question for today, and this is for both Professor Payne and Professor Nolan. I'm going to first pose this to Professor Payne. What does police accountability look like? What does a healthy relationship look like for police in poor Black communities and impoverished communities, in your opinion?
No, that's the question, huh? That's a question okay. Police accountability looks like transparency and justice, or real accountability of all policing infractions, I think, and regular or routine reporting of that accountability to the community, right? To me, in short, that's what a police accountability means. However, or additionally, I think police accountability is something that is ultimately determined by or ultimately signed off on by local residents or communities most affected by harmful policing, right? So what that term means, what that construct or concept means, accountability, ultimately is determined by them, right? Lastly, we have to do more to strengthen, I think, our state and federal laws to charge, prosecute, incarcerate, and/or sue police officers convicted of killing unarmed people. I think the days are gone where, and/or we can no longer accept like the AG's office claim that it's out of their hands because the burden of proof is too high to convict an officer, right? That's said way too much. Definitely in the case of Jeremy McDowell, but in countless other cases in and out of Delaware. And we really have to find a way to also take on qualified immunity. Also, really quickly, police accountability looks like an anti-Black hate bill, right? At state level, we need it on the federal level too. We need the elimination of qualified immunity. I think we finally need to get through a real version of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, right? And again, if not on the federal level, then we can do it on the state level. Why not? Right? I think a healthy relationship looks like a police department with a well-resourced and well-trained community policing unit that routinely is informed and evaluated by a resource board of local residents, right? I also think this community policing unit should actively engage in ongoing pro-social activities with local residents that have nothing to do with crime. Right? They need to be active in the neighborhoods, not just responding to crime. That's what a healthy relationship looks like. Also, it's important to say out loud that policing is an inherently cultural process. Most communities in terms of world history police themselves, right? There's a lot of behavioral and cultural nuance, right? And you need people from the neighborhoods to be able to properly assess and evaluate, and then to determine what actually needs to be aggressively policed or not. A lot of times a conversation and/or there's all kinds of de-escalation practices that can be implemented. Police departments have to do a much better job at aligning its demographic makeup with the communities they serve. 70% of Wilmington Police Department are white, right? About 21% or so are Black, right? Obviously we know Wilmington's predominantly Black community. And/or more police officers have to come from, right, Wilmington and/or local communities, wherever they are. Also, there are a number of key activities that can ensure the trust. Implicit bias testing, cultural sensitivity workshops that emphasizes de-escalation strategies, cooperative pro-social programming, right? And trust can also be achieved through police acquiring just a sharper, deeper awareness of just humanity, kindness, compassion, respect, resisting the temptations of fear, rudeness, and being disrespectful. That's very addictive, right? Particularly people you don't know or the unknown. So I'll stop there. I think, but addressing those kind of factors is the way to achieve trust.
I love that response. And Professor Nolan, what would be your opinion of what would accountability look like for you?
So I just want to build on what Dr. Payne said. I'm working on a project in Baltimore where we're testing some strategies with regard to accountability. And one way we're looking at it is in terms of outcome measures. And so if I could get the screen, the slides back up real quick. I just tell you briefly about some of the perspective on this. Now, you have to remember that what Dr. Payne is talking about too treating people rudely and those sorts of things. This is comes from the police disposition that's developed in the law enforcement game. By changing the game, the officers begin to think and act differently. So it's common sense is to build relationships and work on the things that people want to work on in the community. Can I see the next slide? So I just want to show you. So our research is, look at this barrel on the right. And the barrel represents the community or neighborhood atmosphere. And there's three different elements in this atmosphere. This interdependence, which is things like cohesion and trust among the residents and a good working relationship with the police. Frustration and conflict is conflict in the neighborhood or with the police or with other, with members of the community. And dependence is neighborhoods where there's no interaction between community members and there's just a reliance on the police. So these things are formed by way of a dynamic process, which I don't have time to get into here. But if you go to the next slide, I can tell you why this is important. That in our research over the past really close to a decade in Cleveland and in Pittsburgh, in some neighborhoods in Wilmington, we pulled the data. And if you look at these barrels and in places where there's high levels of frustration and conflict, these places are almost guaranteed to have lots of crime, high levels of victimization, lots of fear, and very little interaction for neighborhoods, like they're threatening suicide to interrupt the fight on the street, for example. But in places where there's high levels of interdependence, crime is not likely, and the intervention is very, very likely. 99% chance that someone would help if someone threatened suicide, or if someone returning from prison, 49%. And then in places where there's high levels of dependence and low levels of interdependence and conflict, it's safer than the top one, where there's lots of frustration, but not nearly like the interdependence. So in other words, here's some research where we can compute the probability of these things happening based on the context. And this is controlling for socioeconomic conditions, racial inequality, and those such a thing. These are just basically these elements of atmosphere. If you go to the next slide, I can show how this might pertain to accountability. So in this slide, you see dependence on the bottom in the vertical scale and interdependence at the top. And you have high crime rates on the left and low crime rates on the right. And so you can, if a police officer is assigned in a neighborhood, and in the Baltimore study, we're looking at 8 anomic neighborhoods. So the starting place is about here. And what we're trying to say is, are there ways for the police and the community together to build higher levels of interdependence and trust and in a relationship and build resources? So at some point, policing strategy might be system level planning and training, coordinating a response so that everyone working together could build a strong, safe neighborhood. And this goes way beyond the law enforcement focus. This is the concerns of a community, or should be the concerns of the police. And they could work together to build these types of neighborhoods. So this is how we're thinking about accountability. So they're assigned, departments and officers are assigned to a particular place, and they're responsible for working with communities to build relationships. And when if you do that, then the common sense is to transparency and accountability, because they're holding each other accountable.
I would like to thank Professor Nolan and Professor Payne for their knowledge and insights on policing today in America. It's not just in Delaware, it's in America. And I would like to thank everyone else for attending the ACLU of Delaware's Lunch and Learn today. We hope you will join us for future events listed on our website. And if you've attended today for continuing legal education credits, you will be emailed certificates shortly confirming your attendance. Everyone, I've had a wonderful day. This was very educational and informational. And I thank everyone for attending.